Welcome to our second video on Redux. In this video we are going to build almost the exact same thing as we built in episode 1. Except when we get to the Redux part, we're actually going to do it backwards. We're going to build the store and the state stuff before we hook it up to the component. And so it's very much like last time, and you should watch the other video. We're going to be doing these two plus a few other smaller Redux examples, so you can just see some simple Redux applications built and see that flow of action and data. So go back and watch the other video if you have not. So in this case, we've started over with a new application made with Create React App. There have been no changes made. We've got our source set up. We have our browser going, and we have the terminal going, so let's get started. Whenever we want to bring in Redux, we are going to need to, before we actually jump into the code, let's go ahead and install Redux. So npm install Redux, and we're also going to be installing react-redux. Redux is a state package. It's a bit of code for handling state in an application. That's what that's what Redux is for. React-redux is glue between React and Redux. You don't have to use React-redux to make Redux work in React applications, but it does have some nice things about it. Some things that will help us get started. Okay, so we've got that started. Let's go look at the code. If we look at the source, let's go to our component and get rid of the stuff we don't need, which is the basic content in the app. This should blink out for us. Excellent. Let's go ahead and open up that console. No warnings. That's what we want. I'm now going to create a component. So let's build the basic React pieces first, then we'll jump into Redux. And so I'm going to create a counter component just like last time. And once again, I'm going to create this as a pure functional component. Like so. Now I'm going to import it. There we go. Let's see if this shows up. Let's see, counter is defined but never used. Well, you know, I've imported counter right there, but I never actually put it in the app. Okay, now it's going to show up. There we go. Excellent. So we have a component that if we were to put props on here, we could pass data in, and we could put the count in right here. Let's say count is going to be no this, because this is a pure functional component. So props.count. And later on, we're going to need an increment button. So like so, there is our basic user interface. And if there's a count on the props, we'll see that there. Let's go through that process of how we would get props in there, and in this case, how we would get Redux to send the state and all the store into the component. All right, so now is the point at which we're going to do Redux, and we're going to go backwards from last time. Now let's review the Redux flow, or the Flux flow. This is, you have a component, and something happens where an action is created right there. That action is dispatched to the store where the reducer is running, or I guess you could say where the reducer is used to change the state. And once the state has been changed, then the component is re-rendered and it all starts over again. We wait until an action happens, and so we create the action, we dispatch it, the reducer changes the state, the component is updated. So instead of hooking up the component pieces this time, we're going to start by hooking up the store and creating it. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it store. Doesn't have to be called that, but that's just how I'm going to do it. So here in this file right here is where we're going to configure the store. So I want to import create store from Redux. What we're doing right here, because it's coming from Redux, is pure Redux. This is not react-redux, which is a different npm package. So this is just Redux right here. So we're going to need this in a second. Now, whenever you want to create your basic store, you're going to start, first of all, with some initial state. I'm creating a counter, and meaning I'm creating a component where there's a number on the page, and whenever I click a button, that number goes up. Actually, at the end of this one, we're going to create a button also for decrementing. But still, starting with what we need a count. And so thinking about our state first, we say we need a count of what we're going to be incrementing. So let's start with 0. So here is our initial state. Let's create our reducer. A reducer is a function. That's all it is. Here it is, reducer. Now a reducer will take 2 arguments. First is the state, and the second is an action. An action is what is executed to change the state. And so these are the 2 basic pieces. So let's finish out this function. Let's put a console log here at the top, and we're going to say reducer, and let's just console log the action. So at the end of every reducer, we want to return the state. All the time, we want to return the state from a reducer. We might change the state, we might not change the state, depends on the situation, but we want to return the state when we leave the reducer. Right now, we're not doing anything to change the state. We're just going to return it, and later on when we hook up the button, that's when we'll actually do something. Or actually, since we're building the store first this time, whenever we start writing the code for doing the action, that's when we'll do it. Okay, so one other thing, and that is before we finish our reducer, we want to go ahead and set the default value of this to the initial state that we defined here. Because whenever Redux boots up, what's going to happen is Redux is going to dispatch its own action, its own initialization action, which will run through the store, and this will initialize the reducer with this state. Or I guess I should say initialize the store with this state. And so that's the very first thing that's going to happen before any of our stuff happens. And we'll see that in a second because of this console log. We will see the Redux store's action that it sends in on initialization. And so let's see, we've got this where we have defined our reducer. We're going to return the state. Let's create a store. And to do that, we call create store, and we pass in our reducer. And at this point, we export default store. So now we have a store. Should be pretty good here. I can't think of anything we need at this point just to get the data showing up on the store. We'll find out on the other side. Okay, so now we've defined our store. Let's change our component so that it's hooked up to the store and all that jazz. And so we went through this last time. What we need to do in here is we need to create a couple functions. We'll start with just the mapping the state to props function. So the basic goal of this function is whenever state changes, what we're doing is we're going to take data from the state which is coming from the store. We're going to take that data and we're going to put it in this component. And so let's create a function called map state to props. And this is going to take the state. we will return whatever this component needs. State will often have way more than any single component will need. And so what we do in here is just give the component exactly what it needs. In this case, what is in state and what we want are the same. But once you get past basically a single component, this tends to be different. So anyway, so state.count. What we're going to do is we're going to put that in this object, and this will get returned. And so that is how this happens. This count, this name right there, is going to be used right there. So that goes there, and one thing we're going to do now is we're going to stop exporting counter, because what you do in react-redux is you don't export your own component. We are actually wrapping our own component and exporting theirs. And so let's go ahead and do that. While we're here, this is actually a really good time to take a look at some documentation. So if we look at react-redux, or if we look at just reduxjs.org, usage with React, this is the place where you should go for some documentation. It's good for reference if you're new to Redux and you're uncomfortable in React. You may find this to be a bit much. I find this documentation to be a little bit much as beginner documentation. So feel free to take a look through here. You might find something useful. This usage with React is just a small part of the Redux documentation. The rest of this, most of this stuff here, is primarily about Redux and not React-Redux. And so if you look through here, and it talks about this idea of implementing container components. We aren't implementing things as separate container components at this point. We will get to that in a future video. So if you see that in any of the stuff that you read, don't worry, we're getting there right now. I'm simplifying and keeping it small. And so down in here is really, it's explaining what we need to do. So if you look at here at the import connect from react-redux, and we see this connect bit, you might remember that last time this is exactly what we did. Okay, so we're going to do that again. So we're going to import connect. So import connect from react-redux. And so what we're going to do is we're going to call connect, and we're going to pass map state to props, and then just immediately turn around and pass this into what comes out of here. And this will wrap our counter into its own component, so that whenever we export, we're not actually exporting our counter anymore. We're exporting the component that comes from connect, that is part of Redux React or react-redux. Okay, so if we go look at our app, we'll take a look at this. Did we save this file? I don't think we did. Nope. So if we go here, we'll see the exact same error that we saw last time. Could not find store in either the context or props of connect counter. So connect counter being the wrapped component. So we either need to do provider, which later video, or pass the store. So what we're talking about is right here. This counter component isn't our component. This is the wrapped component that came out of there. It needs the store. So import store from store and pass it in. And so there's our 0. Now I said earlier that we were going to see the initialization action, and here it is right here in the Chrome console. Reducer, that is this console log right here on line 8. This is the reducer firing, and this action right here is what we're console logging, and that is the action, and action created by Redux itself whenever it initializes. See this init thing right there. Okay, so now we have the data flow happening. If we change the initial value to some other value, we'll see that it is now going to start off at the 4. So we can see that whatever we're setting here as the initial state does in fact make its way into the component. All right, so now let's think about how this works. Let's go back to our diagram. We've created the store, and when we run this thing, Redux itself dispatches its initialization action and runs that reducer in the store, which uses that initial state, and then that state is used in the component. How did the store get hooked up to the component? We did it right here. The store went in as a prop to that counter. That's how we got rid of that error, and that's how the store got hooked up with the component. So that if we have anything set in the store in the initial state, it does show up in the component like so. All right, so now let's add the ability to increment. So since this time we're writing store code before we're writing component code, how do we do this? Well, what we need is this reducer to look at the action coming in and decide if it wants to do something. And so let's do that. Let's say switch on action.type. If we look at this action that was sent by Redux, you will see it has a property called type. All actions should have a property called type with a value describing the action, because that's what you'll use in here to decide what to do, because applications are often going to have many different actions. That's going to be the norm. So therefore the type distinguishes them. So let's give ourselves a case, and we will call this increment, because that's what we're going to do. And we are going to return a new copy of the state. Now, one thing that we need to get into the habit of at this point when we're doing Redux is we need to get into the habit of always returning a brand new object. And so what we don't want to do is just change the current state object and increment it. We actually want to create a brand new object. You get some cool things from this, which we'll discuss later. Let's get used to it now. Always return a brand new object, and one of the best ways of doing that is using this thing called object.assign. And what object.assign does is it allows you to pass in multiple objects, and it basically copies everything. It starts on the left and copies everything from the right. And so if we start with a new object, this guarantees that whatever comes out of here will be, this new state that comes out of here will be a new object. And then we're going to pass the current state. So whatever's in the current state will go into here. And then what we're going to do is change just one piece of state. In this case, we only have one piece of state. But whenever you have a larger application, you have lots more state stuff. What we're going to want to do is we're going to maintain that, which is why this goes here. You'll see this more later. And so what we're going to do here in this third one is change the count. So we're going to say state.count minus, plus 1, because we are incrementing. All right. Now let's go ahead and look at the warning that's going to be there for us, and that is the same one that was there last time. Expected a default case. What that means is it expects us to do this. Instead of returning the state down there as our default action, they actually want us to make it a part of the switch statement. That's actually not a, like a Redux React thing. This is more of just a style thing coming from the linter. So it doesn't really matter, but to get rid of the warning, I did that, and it's fine. It's a totally fine way of doing it. And so we've created our store. We've now added the ability for it to handle an action. So if something comes in here, we can increment the value. Right now we haven't done anything. We're not sending an action. We've got the store ready to handle the action, but for that to happen, we need to create it, and then we need to dispatch it. So let's go do that. So if we go back here to counter, we need to be able to attach essentially an event handler to that button. And then once we attach that event handler, we can create the action and then dispatch it. So let's go back to that documentation we were looking at. And so here we had an example where they did a match, match state to props. That's right here. That's what we just did. The next thing is to have a map dispatch to props. So function map dispatch to props. Now the dispatch function here, this dispatch function is coming from Redux. This is this part of it, this dispatch action. So what we want to do is we want to return an object and say on increment click, where this is a custom name. This can be whatever we want it to be. And then over here, what I want to do is I want to actually run the function. So, or define a function where we create an action. So we can create an action. An action is just a plain object with a type property. So action equals type increment. And now let's dispatch it. So we took map state to props and we passed it in down here. What do we do with match dispatch to props? Well, if we look at our documentation, we will see here that right after map state to props goes map dispatch to props. So, like so. Now what will happen is whenever the component is created, we've got the map state to props and the match dispatch to props happening. I want to put a console log right here because I want to show you something here in a bit. Okay. And so we've got these two functions, we are connecting them. This on increment click in theory then will be in props. So we can do this. All right, let's see how well this works. Seems to work just fine. Few things to note. First of all, note how map dispatch to props and map state to props fired at the beginning, and whenever we make data changes, only map state to props is happening. All right, so this function right here is called every time state changes. This is not. Just something to note. Now, whenever we come in here and we hit this right here, what we're doing is we are creating an action, like so, and then we are dispatching it, and then when it gets dispatched, we see that in the reducer. And so here we see type increment, where before it was that init action. Now this is our custom action. And so we are clicking here, which then runs that function, which we create an action, we dispatch the action, and then it hits the store. And then the store, right, is here. The action comes into the reducer. This state has the previous state, and so we have that console log. And so it's going to look at the type of the action. If it doesn't handle the action, meaning it doesn't match the type in any way, it'll just return the state. It's fine. But if it does match the type, then we will hit this case right here, and then we will make a copy of the state, and then change this one value, and then return that, and that becomes the new state. When that becomes the new state, the component re-renders, and that is the circle of life. All of that. Click, create action, dispatch action, the reducer fires, therefore the state changes, and the component re-renders. That's the flow. Now this is the same thing we built last time. I want to add one more button. I want to add a decrement button so that we can have another action in here, and you can see what it's like to have multiple actions. So since we're doing state before component this time, let's start here, and we can say, what would a decrement action look like? It would look like this. Now the new count will not be a state.count plus 1, it will be state.count minus 1. And thus the state will change. Nothing needs to change for initial state for this, because this is changing the same bit of state. There's no new bits of state here. And so initial state can stay exactly the way it is. And so now all we should need to do if we want to decrement the value is just send an action of decrement. That's all we need to do in the store. So now let's go back to our component itself. And so let's see, let's go ahead and go to map dispatch to props and say on decrement, click const action equals type decrement. All right, so that should work. Go up here, add it to a button. Okay, increment, decrement, excellent, it works. Now you can see down here that increment and decrement are happening. So decrement, it went from -5 to -6. There's the type right there. For increment, I want to go from -9 to -8, so that's incrementing by 1, and so forth. All right, so that's it. How does the decrement work? Well, it works just like the action for incrementing. We click on a different button in the component, and then we create a decrement action, and then we dispatch the action, and then we runs through the reducer. The reducer changes the state. Because the state changes, the component re-renders, and the circle is complete. Okay, so that is almost the exact same application as last time, except this time written backwards. All right, stay tuned for the next video where we will make another application, and I will show you how Redux can be used to hook up the state and the components and all that.